I got all I want, and I got all I need, and I got everything. I got you and me. All I want, I got all I need.
Today we're talking about when marriage is not the best. And I think marriage is not the best when it is unsafe.
So a little bit more serious take on this episode, but something that we feel really important to talk about and to be intentional about talking about, even if it's hard, but very passionate about making sure that we address this topic. We want to make sure we get this right and say the right things. And
so marriage is the best. We talked in our first episode about how we believe in the value of marriage and prioritizing marriage and being intentional about it. And we're going to talk a lot about the positives of marriage and when it is a blessing and when it's beautiful. And I think that it's really important as we launch and as we start to also acknowledge that marriage isn't always the best for all people at all times.
mm-hmm.
And I think that really starts with acknowledging that when a marriage is unsafe, it is not the best. And there are some really necessary steps. There are necessary conversations to have when you find yourself in something that's unsafe.
And there are lots of different meanings of unsafe. There's lots of different forms of abuse, emotional and physical and sexual. And so we're referring to all of the different kinds.
Yeah, anything that would be unsafe, something that is destructive or harmful to the individual. Maybe we could say that would be what we mean by unsafe. Something that is harmful or destructive to any of the individuals involved in the union.
Mm-hmm. And it's kind of a consistent pattern.
Well, yeah. So when I talked to one of the gals at work about this, she drew a distinction between harmful and hurt. Harm and hurt. She basically stated that we're gonna hurt each other in a relationship, right? Hurt feelings, not meeting expectations can be really hurtful. Being a jerk, being self-centered. Those are all hurtful things, and they're going to happen in normal marriages and normal marriage. But harm is like obvious abuse, character assassination, control, manipulation, gaslighting. Those are all forms of harm that are unsafe when they're when they kind of come up in a pattern.
Mm-hmm.
So marriage is not the best when it is unsafe, when it is harmful, when it is destructive to the individual members of the union.
Mm-hmm. And so if we want to say that if you find yourself in a position like that, let me strongly encourage you to reach out and seek for help, because it's just, you can't, face that on your own.
Yeah. So physical harm is a little bit more obvious. When someone is, that one's kind of more obvious to outside observers. If someone is, striking another person, that's an obvious form of abuse or harm. It doesn't have to be when it's behind closed doors, but that one is fairly clear in its boundaries, right? You've crossed a physical boundary with your partner, and they have crossed a physical boundary with you, and that has made things unsafe. I think it's a little bit harder when we're talking about emotional. Sexual is another one that can be a little bit more clear. If someone is feeling violated, if someone is saying no in a sexual context for whatever reason, and then the other partner is continuing on, it would be another form of unsafety, right? The sexual. I think when it comes to emotional or verbal, those lines get a little bit more blurry. There's a little bit more gray, if you will, in the areas of emotional abuse and verbal abuse.
I feel like the way that you word that makes it sound like you're painting it as like lesser.
Sure.
But that is not how we feel.
No. I think actually what I'm trying to do is describe what it looks like. I think it's easier to describe what physical and sexual abuse looks like because there are very, very clear boundaries around someone's physical body. And if someone were to strike, hit, etc., that's an obvious, physical abuse.
To an outsider, yes.
Right.
To someone in that situation, I think that being physically or sexually abused is just as confusing and gray as it is to be emotionally abused, because usually there is emotional abuse in somebody who's abusing them in another way. So there still is like the manipulation and the blame and the shame and all of that. So somebody in those forms of abuse wouldn't say, "Oh, I recognize it. I'm getting abused," because I think that it's confusing for most people in any kind of abusive setting. So, and then I also think that there are pretty clear lines and ways to describe what emotional abuse looks like, and I think that's on the power cycle.
So when I say gray, what I mean by that is sometimes people don't know what to forgive. Like what to forgive in the context of, what is name calling? Like, for example, you called me a butt-faced butterbutt recently.
Yes.
And although very hurtful, it did not cause me harm.
You should probably clarify.
Well, I was being a butt, and then you called me a butt-faced butterbutt.
So
is that enough clarification?
So you are being sarcastic when you said that it was hurtful. That's what I mean. You should clarify. I didn't say it out of anger.
Deeply hurtful, yes.
I didn't. It wasn't like an angry conversation.
Do you mean my sarcasm wasn't clear?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, well, very deeply hurtful, as in not hurtful at all.
It was very funny, and we both laughed.
I loved it.
And you tweeted it because you thought it was so funny.
I didn't tweet it.
What?
There's no such thing as Twitter anymore. You didn't know that? He calls it X.
No, you told me you made a Twitter account for the podcast.
I made an X account for the podcast. I can't. There's no such thing as Twitter.
You told me you made a Twitter account.
I probably said X.
You absolutely did not. So anyways, no, why would I know that? I do not care about what Elon is doing.
What? Anyways, I think we need to talk about that later. It's very offensive to me. Elon is doing wonderful things. But I see what you mean. So here's a little bit more context to my thoughts on this. When I talk to people within the like when they are being harmed, I find that people who are in an emotionally abusive marriage are more confused about the abuse and can more easily convince themselves that it's not happening than people who are being physically harmed. That's what I meant. Mm-hmm. Is that clearer?
Yeah, so I don't think that the bounds of emotional abuse are more gray and difficult to define, but I do think that if you are in an emotionally abusive relationship, that yes, it could be trickier to realize.
More confusing.
And yes.
Yeah.
I don't know what your sign language means.
It means get closer to the microphone. Yeah, you want to speak like you want to kiss it, like you kiss me. Well, not like you kiss me, but like, you want to kiss it.
All right.
So what does it look like to be in an emotionally abusive relationship? There's often harm, right? So it is harmful or destructive in your partner's language. So that would be name calling, a character assassination. We said that, manipulation, gaslighting. So making you kind of second guess yourself, telling you that what you think happens didn't happen. That's kind of a clearer sign of gaslighting. And then there's this really cool resource that we'll link in the show notes it's called the Power and Control Wheel. So you can look up this wheel. There's not different versions, but there's a lot of different images on Google that you can look at. And there are 8 different sections for the Power and Control Wheel. And Becca's just kind of read some of the questions that it brings up. And this is a good maybe screening tool for you to look at your marriage and kind of see if you feel like you resonate with any of these different parts of the Power and Control Wheel. One way to say this would be these are kind of common areas of abuse or common
patterns of behavior found in emotional abusive relationships.
Yes.
And they are using economic abuse. So maybe preventing her from getting or keeping a job, making her or him. Can I just say her and we just agree that I'm saying him or her because I don't have to say it every single time?
So every time you say her,
I mean
you
him
mean
or her.
Him or her.
Taking their money, not letting them know about or have access to family income. The second part is using coercion and threats, making or carrying out threats to do something to hurt her, threatening to leave, commit suicide, report to welfare, making him or her drop charges, making him or her do illegal things.
So that's the law area or section.
The third is using intimidation, making them afraid by using angry looks, actions, gestures, smashing things, destroying property, abusing pets, displaying weapons.
Yep. So any form of intimidation is at times a part of an emotionally abusive dynamic.
The next is using emotional abuse, like putting her down, making her feel bad about herself, calling her names, making her think she's crazy, playing mind games, humiliating her, making her feel guilty. Next would be using isolation, controlling what she does, who she sees, talks to, what she reads, where she goes, limiting her outside involvement, using jealousy to justify actions, and then minimizing, denying, and blaming, making light of the abuse, not taking her concerns about it seriously, saying the abuse didn't happen, shifting responsibility for abusive behavior, saying she caused it, so gaslighting.
Yeah.
And then next would be using the children, making her feel guilty about the children, using the children to relay messages, using visitation to harass her, threatening to take the children away. And then lastly, using male privilege, treating her like a servant, making all of the big decisions, acting like the master of the castle, being the one to define men and women's roles. And I think that Christians can have a hard time with that one. And I think that we could do a whole nother podcast on just that alone. I think that subject alone. I think that there are some valid points to that,
So there's what you're saying is that maybe there's some gray when you're thinking about like roles, when you think about the differences in men and women and the validity in some of that.
Well, here's the only gray.
Yeah.
Is that in a healthy marriage, some of those role things can be healthy, but we're not talking about a healthy marriage. So some of these role things are not healthy. He is not loving
using
her
roles in a way that is destructive.
Yeah, like he's acting like he's the master and she's the slave.
Sure.
Not like I am actually a servant of you because I love you the way Christ loved the church, and he served the church by laying down his life. So it's quite a different idea than what the biblical role would look like.
Right.
It's not biblical.
Yeah, I think that any time that harm comes into play, like using roles in a destructive way, so demeaning, there is no room for a demeaning the other party in the role, controlling what the other person does or doesn't do in their gender roles, making like lots of demands because I am this and you are that, so that means you have to do this and I have to do that, but not in a way that is constructive and builds up the marriage, because there's obviously ways to build up roles in a really healthy way. Actually, I don't know if you can have a healthy marriage without there being roles, right? Like roles are necessary. Mm-hmm. We have to divide up, and in order to conquer it, there's two of us, right? And that's the blessing, is that there are two of us. And so by the nature of there being two, there has to be a breakdown in what we're doing. Mm-hmm. And you can either use that in a really healthy, beautiful way to say, I love you and I'm going to support you and I'm going to do the dishes and I'm going to unload the dishwasher so that maybe you have a chance to load it if you get a chance. And, if you don't, maybe I'll serve you and do the dishes tonight. And, you made a comment the other night about dishes, and
I said, this kitchen.
Oh yeah, kitchen.
It was absolutely destroyed and filthy. 2 days ago, I had it spotless.
Right, and so I stepped in and I
Stayed up after I went to bed.
Yeah.
And cleaned the kitchen almost to my standard, but you did a good job.
I left one of the counters not clean so that I could stand up against that counter and look out on all the things that were clean. And to my eyes, to everything I was taking in, it was spotless. Just don't turn around.
Right.
That's the rule. Don't turn around.
The last thing I'll say about the roles thing is that in a healthy marriage, there's room for flexibility.
Around
and
the
there's
roles.
Yeah, because it can change in different seasons. Mm-hmm. Sometimes one spouse might be going through depression and the other supports them and picks up what the other spouse can't handle. Or sometimes they're sick, or they just had a baby, or there's or they're going through their master's school, or there's so many different reasons why the roles could change or shift or adjust a little bit. In a healthy marriage, there is room for that, and there's room for flexibility. And it's not just demands that are made from one person to the other constantly. I demand you be this all the time for me, and I will never step in and help you with that because that's your role and it's not mine. And so, yeah, in a healthy marriage, there's room for flexibility, and there's room for each partner to express what they can and cannot do and what they need help with and all of those things.
Yeah, I think the communication piece is really important when you talk about roles. And yeah, so communication and flexibility for sure are important parts that create more health in a marriage. And inflexibility and a lack of ability to communicate around what we're doing, a lack of flexibility in seasons, of lack of flexibility in those times when I can't, right? I can't pick up slack. That is obviously, that creates difficulty in the marriage. So yeah, I liked how you highlighted the flexibility around the roles and how a mark of health is flexibility and communication when it comes to role dynamics. And inflexibility can lead to an abusive dynamic.
And not always,
Not always.
Sometimes people are, that's a characteristic trait, but
Sure.
Normally, outside of an abusive relationship, and if that's just their character trait, they could maybe recognize that and be willing to say,
right,
yeah, that's not my strong point. I'm not the most flexible person.
Yeah, and I think that oftentimes what we see growing up has a lot to do with what our role assumptions are. And so if you grew up with one role assumption, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's wrong. What we see growing up definitely shapes our, responses and expectations in the marriage. So when we can have flexibility around that, that can be really healthy and helpful. And when just because we don't have flexibility around it doesn't necessarily mean that it's abusive. So, but that element of harm, I think, again, comes back really, that's a really strong indicator. If the demand and the dynamic is harmful, and it can't be talked about, right? That's abusive.
Yes, if there's no room to talk about it, it's always met with defensiveness, or they turn it around on you and blame it on you, and it's just a pattern of that all the time, and there's no change, then that is abusive.
Yeah. So the questions that you just highlighted, that wheel, it's called the power and control wheel. It's a really cool tool. I always use cool in such interesting ways.
Really helpful tool.
It's a really helpful tool for kind of screening and asking yourself questions on whether or not I am in an emotionally abusive dynamic, to kind of cut through the gray. And if you resonate with any of those things, if you resonate with some of those categories, then seeking help and a helpful person to confide in would be advised, to talk through some of the dynamics, some of the things that maybe that you're identifying, and to get some support.
And we want to highlight what that reaching out for help should look like, because we acknowledge that sometimes reaching out for help sometimes doesn't always go well. Sometimes people don't believe you, or, they might say, well, it's because you haven't prayed enough, or you haven't submitted enough, or all kinds of things people could say.
Yeah, we want to highlight the idea that if you approach someone and confide in them, and you are not met with belief, and you are met with blame, then that probably is not a healthy person to confide in. So during a season of our church, our church life, we did a training with a group called Grace. So we should probably maybe link their website in the bio, because they have videos and resources, and they do lots and lots of trainings on abuse in a church context.
So GRACE stands for Godly Response to Abuse in a Christian Environment.
Dude, where did you...
I always remembered that.
What?
Yeah.
That came out of your brain?
Yes, it's in my brain.
Oh, my word. What a beautiful brain.
Thank you.
You're welcome. But yeah, so in the Grace training, the reason I bring that up is in the Grace training, they talk about how in an abuse situation, or if you're ever being told about an abuse situation, you always start with belief. Yeah, so if the person doesn't start with belief, then find someone else to confide in. And please don't give up. Please keep trying.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to tell us about a time when maybe when you have felt unsafe in our marriage?
So early in our marriage, I don't remember what year was it. Do you remember what year this was?
1 or 2.
Yeah, 1 or 2. It was very, very early on in our marriage. You struggled a lot with anger, and so there was one instance when you got very angry and were yelling a lot and very loudly, and you remember kicking a beach ball in the living room.
Yeah, I remember standing in the doorway from the kitchen to the living room and just like yelling and kicking a beach ball, just like punting it in the living room.
And I got up and went into our bathroom and locked the door. And I just stayed in there for as long as I needed to until I felt like you were calm and I was safe to come out. And we wanted to mention this story because we wanted to acknowledge that sometimes in a healthy marriage, we can act unhealthy and we can respond unhealthy and even harmful. Like, hurtful things happen in every marriage.
Yep.
And we wanted to acknowledge that
there can be harmful moments.
That there can be harmful moments, even in healthy marriage.
Yeah.
However, the difference between the abuse and then the healthy marriage is that there was never another instance like that.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't a pattern of behavior, a pattern of our communication, that it was consistently getting to a level of harm. It was consistently escalating. I wasn't consistently escalating to that point.
Yeah, and here we are almost 10 years into our marriage now.
Right.
And if that was still the way that you handled disagreements, or me saying anything that you didn't like, or saying it in a way that you didn't like, or anything, if that was how you handled things still, and you were not willing to hear me when I said later on, I told you that I was feeling afraid in that moment, and that I locked myself in the bathroom. And at the time you didn't recognize that.
Yeah, I hadn't realized that it had made you feel unsafe.
Yeah.
In that moment.
And so later on, when I told you that, your response was compassion and like, I'm so regret, and I'm so sorry, and like hearing what I said to you, you heard it and you responded, and you didn't want to make me feel that way. And you could acknowledge that how you behaved was wrong.
Right.
So, but if you would have reacted differently, if it wouldn't have been even an option for me to tell you that you made me feel unsafe, or if I did try to tell you and you denied it, or like, well, it was your fault because, you did this, and so that's why I got angry. If you didn't say that, then I wouldn't have got angry like that. If you would have turned the blame on me or been defensive or not been willing to hear what I had to say to you, not been willing to change on it, and here we are, 10 years in, and you're still acting that way.
Yeah, and I want to say that if I would have continued on in that, even for a month, like if it would have continued to escalate like that, say once a week or every other week or monthly even, that is a pattern enough. Like,
yeah,
so,
no, I'm not saying it doesn't have to be 10 years for it to count as abuse.
It almost sounded like
I
to
can
me.
I can see how that would sound. That I just was saying, I just was thinking if you were still like that. But yes, no, it wouldn't have to be 10 years to qualify for abuse. No, I am not saying that.
No, yeah, and I didn't think that you were. I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah.
That like the pattern wouldn't have had to have lasted this long, even if it had lasted, if it had come up in a consistent pattern, then it would have been an abusive pattern.
With no willingness to change, no willingness to hear, no willingness to.
Right. Or, yeah. And I mean, it would have been abusive even if I was willing to change, if it had continued to happen.
Well, yes. I suppose when I say willingness to change, I think of like actually changing.
Yeah.
But yes, no, I mean, definitely in abusive relationships, people can say, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it.
I think that happens all of the time.
So, yeah.
In abusive relationships.
That's not what I mean by willingness. Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
And I think I'm just trying to make a really clear distinction. Like if I would have continued, if that would have happened in a pattern, it would have been abusive, regardless of my willing to change, regardless of my intentions even. That's an abusive pattern. And oftentimes abusive people don't necessarily recognize that they're being abusive. And sometimes they're not even intending to be abusive. Just because an abusive person is being abusive doesn't mean that that's their intention, that they're not intending harm. But the fact that there is harm there means that it was abusive, right? And so, especially when taken into context of a pattern, when there's a consistency to it, when it's, and then when you add the unwillingness to change on top of that, when you did bring it up to me, and thankfully it wasn't happening ongoing before you brought it up to me, but there was that moment that you were afraid and that it was harmful. And I was livid and out of control. And so we had that scary moment. And yeah, we wanted to acknowledge that we had that scary moment, that we've had the scary moment, so as to normalize conversation around harmful moments. Like, I'm really grateful that you entrusted that moment to me, or like that you would tell me that it was harmful, that you would tell me that it was scary. Because I think that when we talk about when we have those difficult conversations, it opens up the door for change. It opens up the door for repentance. It opens up the door for growth and intimacy and growing satisfaction in the relationship. So having those conversations early on, I think, allowed us to improve our communication. And also I think that it probably was helpful in helping us to not create a pattern around those things.
Right.
So marriage is not the best when it's unsafe. And then I think marriage is not the best when it lacks love. It lacks a connection. When we talk about unsafety, we're often talking about harm and like big, harmful things. But when it lacks love, marriage is also really, really hard. I think that I resonate with having felt unloved at times in our relationship. And I'm sure that you could point to times when you have felt unloved in our relationship. One pattern of feeling unloved in your relationship is connected to the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And the 4 horsemen is a concept that the John and Julie Gottman came up with. And it's in their study of marriage, they identified 4 different dynamics that are indicative of actually the end of a marriage, when a marriage is like leaning toward or moving toward divorce. And that is criticism, contempt, stonewalling, and defensiveness. Do you have anything to jump in and say, or do you want me to just kind of go?
You can keep going.
Okay. So criticism involves attacking someone's character or personality, rather than addressing like a specific behavior. So you never think about anyone but yourself would be a criticism. I feel neglected when you don't consider my needs would be a complaint. And complaints are normal in marriage and can be actually really helpful, right? When I hear your complaint, and I allow it to influence me, then I get better at being your partner and knowing how to love you and knowing how to do marriage with you. You never think about anyone but yourself is destructive and hurtful and often leads to me feeling unloved, because you often use that phrase. You never think about anyone but yourself.
I say it all the time.
It's like your...
yeah, it's my catchphrase.
Your catchphrase, right?
Yeah.
That's sarcasm.
Which you will find often on our podcast.
Yes. Sarcasm.
Now served daily.
Now
Is that
served
what you
daily.
wanted me to say?
Yes, thank you. So yes, criticism is one way that, well, I think that is kind of a universal reality that when a marriage has lots of criticism, we feel it leads to feeling unloved. Contempt is another one. This is the most destructive of the 4 horsemen. Contempt involves treating your partner with disrespect, mockery, sarcasm, or scorn. It often manifests itself in eye rolling, name calling, or hostile humor. So
like calling each other a butt-faced butterbutt.
No. Contempt undermines the emotional foundation of the relationship. So, yeah, a contemptuous attitude is kind of a hateful one.
Yeah, I think of disdain.
Yeah. There's lots of great words that kind of live in this area. But hateful, it's really when you're so disconnected, you're so hurt, oftentimes I think hurt or wounded, that you're treating this other person like they aren't a person, like they're lower and less than, and the communication and the dynamics around the relationship turn from maybe like hard or to this completely like rejection of this person. And then through that hurt, through the rejection comes a disrespect for them as a person, a mockery of them as a person, sarcasm, really like a demeaning sarcasm. Oh, really? Like, oh, you were trying when you did that. How is my demeaning sarcasm?
Spot on.
Splendid. Or scorn. And I think scorn is even a better word than maybe sarcasm. I think, we would like to think that sarcasm can be a very helpful, playful, fun dynamic.
Well, and for us it can be.
We do, because we use it in a
could be hurtful for other marriages,
or even harmful.
Yeah.
And the next horseman is defensiveness.
No, you skipped stonewalling.
I was doing them out of order. I announced them out of order.
Oh, that's fine.
Are you criticizing me?
Continue. I would never.
You wouldn't?
Never.
Oh, well, thank you. Defensiveness is, okay, so when you're feeling attacked or criticized, a defensive response is to deny responsibility, make excuses, or counterattack. This response prevents constructive dialogue and resolution of the issue at hand. So defensiveness is basically, coming to your own defense. And
shuts down conversation, and there's not really a way to get around it. It's not really a way for to work through it. If you're never going to take responsibility, then we can never communicate about the issues that are happening here, and we can never grow from them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it helps. It makes it hard for people to feel heard. When this is something that I've struggled with, and I think that actually most men have struggled with, is when the wife brings up a complaint, it's very easy, especially when you're tired or hungry or lonely or anxious. When you receive a complaint, oftentimes it feels very, big. It's hard to manage. It oftentimes makes us as men feel ashamed or inadequate. And then we can get really defensive because we have to defend. In order to avoid our shame or our inadequacy, we have to then defend ourselves. So, you can bring up, well, look at all these things that I did. Why would you feel that way if I did all of these things? I know that I have used a similar phrase to that. Excuses, so I only did that because of this. I only responded that way because of you're bonking your headphone on the microphone. I wouldn't have yelled at you if you did that. Counterattack, that comes out, something like, maybe I was unloving, but you did this, that, and the other thing. So what do you expect? Like attacking you back. So yeah, defensiveness can be a really difficult pattern to break out of. And then finally, stonewalling. This is when a partner withdraws from the conversation by just shutting down emotionally or physically, avoiding engagement, going silent, going to sleep. It's often a response to feeling overwhelmed or flooded by emotions, but it leads to a lack of communication and connection. So those four dynamics in a marriage often tend to create a sense of feeling unloved.
You want to share on when you've felt unloved in our marriage?
Yeah, I definitely think there have been moments where I have felt unloved. Oftentimes, especially early on in our marriage, there are moments of coldness that I would pick up on. Maybe not even moments of coldness that I would pick up on, but moments where I felt like the response that I was expecting to get, based on all of the things that I was doing, based on how much I was working or how hard I was working or how much I was pouring out, I was just not getting the response that I was looking for. And I interpreted it as cold. I maybe even interpreted it as stonewalling, but which was really hurtful to me. And there's been moments, throughout our marriage where I have interpreted it that way. Oftentimes I learned later on that, basically everything went terrible and the whole day was shot, and really it had nothing to do with me, but I was personalizing those moments. And so those are the times that probably have felt most unloved over the course of our marriage. And then, we often have to talk about those moments when I felt, hey, there was some coldness, or you feel really cold to me. And then, we have to work through and kind of wade through the emotions of the day, or the stress of the day, or the hormones of the day, or whatever that might have looked like. And so, yeah, I guess those are some of the core or like key moments that I have felt unloved over the course of our marriage. I'm really grateful, though, that we have an opportunity, or we have like developed a skill, if you will, for engaging in those really hard moments and those hard conversations when you're feeling distant, or I'm feeling distant, or I'm feeling disconnected. And then we oftentimes will just sit and communicate. We'll communicate the hard things. We'll communicate the hard emotions. And oftentimes that is such a powerful refresh. It reconnects us. It reinvigorates us. It makes us feel, heard and seen, and it makes us feel loved and connected when we're able to just kind of talk through and walk through those hurtful moments and be heard. And I think that that's actually a really great kind of antidote to those feelings of being unloved, is to feel heard, to feel known, and to be able to have those hard conversations about, our moments of disconnect. And I really appreciate our ability to do that. So when it comes to counseling and abuse, there's a really important screening that has to take place before a marriage is actually viable for coming into counseling. And I just wanted to really quick touch base on that, because if you are in an abusive relationship and you go to a counselor, one of two things are going to happen. One, you will receive counseling as if this is a relationship that can be counseled, even though it's abusive. Or two, you will be screened properly. It will be found out that there's an abusive dynamic going on in the relationship, and it will be suggested that you seek individual help before you can do relationship counseling. When an abusive relationship is treated like a healthy relationship in the context of marriage counseling, the suggestions are often reinforce the abuse. So if a healthy marriage comes in and I say, oh yeah, like we can talk about gender roles, and because gender roles are normal parts of relationship, but in fact there is harm around gender roles in the marriage, then I am encouraging the abusive party in their abuse, because I'm normalizing that conversation, and then they get to then take that home and say, well, Peter said this is normal for me to ask this of you, right? And that's just one example of how when you treat an abusive marriage as a normal marriage or a healthy marriage in the marital context, it often creates harm. So you can do a lot of harm as a counselor by attempting counseling in abusive contexts. So if you are in an abusive relationship and you're in a harmful relationship and there's a harmful pattern and you've attempted to communicate in your marriage, going to counseling yourself or seeking supports outside of, seeking support is advised and really helpful and healthy, and probably the necessary steps to start the healing process. Doing marriage counseling when there is emotional or physical or sexual or verbal abuse or spiritual abuse is not advised and should not be engaged in.
And I think, were you going to mention that not only should you seek, if you're in an abusive relationship, not only should you seek support outside of it, but that it might be necessary to physically separate from the abuse in order for the abuse to stop.
That is absolutely one of the tools that can be used for creating the necessary change. Oftentimes, there has to be a shakeup in the system enough that the abusive person develops an insight for what they're doing, develops an insight for like into themselves enough that they can then make the changes that are necessary. Oftentimes that does not happen when the abused person stays in the environment because of habits, psychology, just how those habits have been ingrained in the system. Etching them out, carving them out, often takes big tools, and you can learn about a lot of those tools and get good, healthy advice in the context of a healthy counseling relationship or a healthy mentorship or a healthy support person who sees what you're going through, who you can confide in, and who can kind of help you to be safe, essentially, right? To escape the harm, to be out of harm's way, because it is only out of harm's way that then we can heal and that things can get better. And that can be really, really difficult.
And we're going to be linking a lot of those great resources in the episode description, right? So you'll be able to find a lot of those here.
Yeah. We're going to link the article that we were talking about regarding the 4 Horsemen. We're going to be linking a book called Is It Abuse? I think it's by Abby Strickland, who has some really great resources. Actually, I've seen some YouTube videos as well that we might be able to find that just kind of talk through, this is what it looks like. So if you have questions about what it looks like, looking at resources such as that can be really helpful. But yeah, and we'll have a bunch of different resources in the show notes. Yeah, marriage is the best. Even in hard conversations, even in difficult times, it really is the best. And it's often through working through, the hard times that it gets better, that there's beauty in it, and that your intimacy can grow and your satisfaction can grow and your love and attraction can grow. But that has to happen outside the context of abuse. There is not a growth in the marriage when it comes to being stuck in a harmful cycles. That seems like a very sweeping statement, but
it's true.
Yeah. So suffering outside of abuse is great.
Yeah, suffering in a marriage, suffering together, working through the hard things together, having the hard conversations, laughing with each other, teasing each other, all of it.
Yeah. Can make more like life and marriage deeper and more wonderful and more beautiful.
And that was and is God's design for marriage. And that was his heart for marriage all along.
Well, marriage is the best. If you want to write to us, we have an email. It's in the show notes, but it's also marriageisthebest@yahoo.com. Spelled correctly.
All right.
We actually have a phone number too. You can leave a voicemail for us if you want to be featured on a show. So, but if you want to leave a comment or give us some feedback, or
yeah, we recognize, I think we should say, we recognize that this is a very extensive and somber topic, and we didn't cover,
right,
a fraction of what is all happening and what's all there and what it all looks like. And we, obviously we cannot cover everything.
Yeah, I would say we've started the conversation, and we hope that in starting the conversation, we might inspire you to continue the conversation. If you need to seek help, If you have someone who sought help and maybe there was a moment of disbelief within you, that you could reach back out. And we hope that this is a helpful tool and that it could be used for creating more health in marriages. So yeah, feel free to reach out, or if you have comments or thoughts, feel free to share them with us. And yeah, thanks, honey.
Yep. Thank you.
I love you.
Love you.
And